In 1920, there was a line of people stretching around city blocks in Boston. But they weren't waiting for food or tickets or jobs. They were fighting each other for the chance to hand over their life savings to a complete stranger. That stranger was about to steal $15 million in today's money and accidentally create the blueprint for every financial scam that followed. His name was Charles Ponzi, and his deception was so shocking that even now, over a century later, the scam still bears his name. How did a broke immigrant with 2 felony convictions convince an entire city to trust him with everything they owned? How did he turn one impossible dream into thousands of people's worst nightmare? This is the story of the man who proved that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who break into your house. They're the ones you invite inside. This is the untold truth of how Charles Ponzi didn't just steal money. He stole the American dream itself and sold it back as a lie. Chapter 1. The Making of a Monster. Charles Ponzi was born in Italy on March 3, 1882, and from the very beginning, his life was defined by one toxic emotion: shame. His father was a hard-working postman, and while his family was financially comfortable, they used to be so much more than that. Ponzi's grandparents and great-grandparents had all been successful businessmen, merchants, and public officials. The family's fall from grace affected young Charles deeply, filling him with a bitterness that would eventually destroy thousands of lives. As a teenager, Charles would look around at his circumstances and wonder why he had to suffer for his family's failing fortunes. Why couldn't he have been born rich and enjoy a life of leisure without worrying about jobs or money? These weren't just idle daydreams. They were the seeds of a dangerous obsession that would consume him for the rest of his life. We've all felt inadequate around people with more money, but most of us don't let that feeling drive us to become criminals. Ponzi was different. When his father died, Ponzi inherited a modest sum of money, and his mother had her heart set on him using it to attend a prestigious college. But Ponzi had other plans entirely. Instead of studying and going to classes, he decided to burn through his savings by dressing in the latest fashions and eating at the fanciest restaurants in town. At night, he'd hit the theater, the opera, or gamble at casinos with his wealthy friends. Nothing was too extravagant or expensive for him. Ponzi was living a lie, pretending he was just like his rich friends with endless money to spend. But it was all an illusion, and like all illusions, it couldn't last forever. His inheritance money finally ran out, and since he'd completely neglected his studies, he had no chance of graduating. His uncle offered him work as a clerk, but the idea of finding a regular job repulsed Ponzi, who considered himself too good for what he called menial labor. This was the moment that would define the rest of his life. Rather than accept reality and do honest work, Ponzi made a choice that would echo through history. He felt he had only one option left: travel to America and strike it rich there. He didn't want to earn wealth. He wanted to simply find it, as if it were lying around waiting for someone clever enough to pick it up. This wasn't ambition. This was delusion, and it was about to meet the harsh reality of the real world. Chapter 2. The School of Scamming. In 1903, Ponzi arrived in Boston aboard the SS Vancouver with a heart full of shame and a head full of impossible dreams. He believed that the only way to redeem himself in his mother's eyes was to return to Italy as a rich man. The only problem was he had absolutely no idea how to do that legitimately. America proved to be the wake-up call that young Ponzi desperately needed, but tragically he learned all the wrong lessons. There was no more inheritance money and no more relatives to bail him out of trouble. As distasteful as he found physical labor, he had no choice. If he wanted to eat, he needed to work. Ponzi spent the next few years traveling up and down the East Coast, from New York to Florida, working as a sign painter, waiter, grocery clerk, dishwasher, factory hand, insurance salesman, and sewing machine repairman. But here's the pattern that would define his entire life. None of these jobs lasted long. Ponzi either quit because he hated the work, or he was fired because he tried to cheat the customers. This often meant he resorted to stealing or begging for scraps of food and sleeping in parks. It was a far cry from his carefree days as a high roller back in Rome. But even when Ponzi did manage to scrape together a bit of cash, he would inevitably spend it all on a big night out or a weekend vacation to remind himself of the good old days. He was learning to live in a fantasy, constantly escaping reality rather than facing it. Every honest job felt like a betrayal of who he thought he was meant to be. In 1907, hoping that Canada would prove more welcoming and lucrative, Ponzi traveled to Montreal. At first, things seemed to be looking up for him. He found work as a clerk at a bank called Banco Zarossi that mainly served Italian immigrants. It was the same type of job that Ponzi had turned down back in Rome because he considered himself too good for it, but a few years on the streets working for minimum wage had certainly changed his perspective. Unfortunately for Ponzi, his new job didn't last long, but not because of anything he did. His boss, Zarossi, was running a con game, and Ponzi was about to get his first masterclass in financial fraud. Zarossi was using an age-old scam known as robbing Peter to pay Paul. He was taking money from his newest clients and using it to pay off his older ones. This allowed him to offer 6% interest rates on all deposits, which was double the average rate at the time. But the clients started getting suspicious when their relatives back home kept complaining that they weren't receiving the money the bank was supposed to send. In mid-1908, when the authorities began investigating the bank for embezzlement, Zarossi filled a suitcase with all the cash he could carry and fled to Mexico, leaving his employees and his family to deal with the fallout from his scam. This wasn't just Ponzi's first real job, it was his criminal education. He watched his boss steal thousands of dollars using nothing but charm, false promises, and creative accounting. Most importantly, he saw how easy it was to convince desperate people to hand over their money if you just promised them what they wanted to hear. Zarossi had shown him the blueprint for the perfect crime, and Ponzi was taking notes. Not wanting to be involved in the investigation and fallout from Zarossi's scam, Ponzi decided to travel back to the United States. But before leaving, he made a decision that revealed his true character. Rather than starting from scratch again with honest work, he thought he would give himself a little going-away present by forging a check from one of the bank's clients, a shipping firm called the Canadian Warehousing Company. Ponzi stole a blank check from the manager's checkbook and filled it out for $423.58, what he thought was a believable and unsuspicious amount. But as soon as he tried to cash the fraudulent check, the bank teller easily spotted the fake signature and alerted the police. For a man who would later steal millions, Ponzi was caught stealing pocket change. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison at St. Vincent de Paul Penitentiary, but this was just the beginning of his criminal career. Prison didn't reform Charles Ponzi, it educated him. He spent those years thinking about what had gone wrong, not morally, but tactically. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd tried to do. He was embarrassed that he'd been caught so easily. When he was released on parole after 2 years, he immediately proved that he'd learned nothing about right and wrong, but everything about being a better criminal. Chapter 3. Love and Lies. Instead of going straight, Ponzi took 5 Italian immigrants with him, men fresh off the boat without proper papers because he'd been paid to smuggle them into America. He figured this would set him up with a nice quick payday now that he was a free man again. But once again, he got caught and was arrested. Ponzi hoped that if he pled guilty, the judge would go easy on him and let him off with a small fine. Instead, he received another 2 years in federal prison in Atlanta. After being released from jail for the second time, Ponzi was unsure of his next move. He'd spent his time in prison coming up with various schemes to get rich, but they all required money, and Ponzi was penniless. With little choice, he wandered from state to state again, working whatever odd jobs came his way. Eventually, he found a decent position as a clerk with an import-export business called the J.R. Poole Company in Boston. After a decade and a half in North America, he'd ended up in the same place where he'd begun. But life in Boston was decidedly better for Ponzi the second time around. For once, he was actually good at his job and was promoted for it. More importantly, Ponzi met 21-year-old Rose Necco and instantly fell head over heels for her. The first time they spoke, Ponzi was so nervous that he could barely string 2 words together. Fortunately for him, the feeling was mutual, and the two got married in early 1918. His new married life made Ponzi feel happy, but it also made him feel desperately inadequate. Even though Rose was content with a simple life, Ponzi had much grander ambitions. He wanted to shower her with diamond rings, fancy clothes, and expensive holidays. In his mind, love wasn't just about emotion, it was about proving his worth through material success. He couldn't just be a husband, he had to be a provider worthy of the lifestyle he thought she deserved. Every villain thinks they're the hero of their own story, and Ponzi had convinced himself that everything he was about to do was for love. Obviously, showering Rose with luxury was never going to happen on a clerk's salary, so 6 months after the wedding, Ponzi quit his steady job at JR Pool and began looking for something that would make him rich quickly. He started by joining his father-in-law's wholesale fruit-selling business. The company was struggling, and since Ponzi always bragged to his wife about being a financial genius, this was his chance to prove it. However, instead of saving the failing business, Ponzi's involvement led to its complete bankruptcy by the end of the year. Rather than accepting that he might not be the business genius he claimed to be, Ponzi blamed external factors and immediately started planning his next venture. Undeterred by this recent failure, Ponzi rented a small office to start his own import and export business. But the world took no notice of him. Ponzi lacked the experience, the contacts, and the reputation needed to attract any serious business. However, he refused to believe that he was the problem. He thought that maybe he just needed to advertise his services more effectively. Unfortunately, a few quick calculations made him realize that advertising costs were well outside his financial reach, and just like that, Ponzi's import and export business became another failed venture. But this failure had already given him his next idea. When Ponzi saw how much money it would cost him to publicize his services, he thought that maybe he should publish his own trade magazine. Other companies would pay him the same kind of giant advertising fees he couldn't afford to pay others. Ponzi had zero experience in publishing, but in his mind, this was already a $1 million business idea. He would call his magazine The Trader's Guide and send it for free to 100,000 companies, doubling the circulation with each new issue. According to Ponzi's calculations, his initial mailing would cost him around $35,000, but he would make $80,000 in advertising income since he was certain that companies would be lining up to publicize their services in his magazine. Certain of success, Ponzi rented a much larger office and hired 3 staff members. Then he began writing letter after letter to investors and business owners about the possibility of getting involved with the first-ever issue of The Trader's Guide. He was so convinced of his own genius that he couldn't imagine anyone saying no to such an obvious opportunity. Then reality came crashing down on Ponzi like a ton of bricks. Nobody was interested. Nobody cared about his obscure little trade magazine, and they certainly weren't willing to pay his exorbitant rates to get featured in it. When Ponzi went to his local bank to get a loan because he was almost out of money, he got another harsh dose of reality. The bank president refused his application on the spot, telling him that he would rather close Ponzi's account than loan him a single dollar. These were bitter pills to swallow, and left with little choice, he had to fire his staff and sublet his office space to earn some money. But his dreams and ambitions remained as powerful as ever. Ponzi hoped that his next idea would be the one that would finally make him rich. He had no idea that his next idea would make him infamous instead. Chapter 4. The Perfect Storm. One day in August 1919, Ponzi was going through his mail when he spotted a letter from Spain. Back when he still thought that The Trader's Guide would become the next big thing in advertising, Ponzi hadn't been content with simply doing business in America. He'd envisioned that his guide would be translated into multiple languages and that he would expand his business into Europe. He'd contacted many foreign companies about the possibility of doing business together, and it seemed that at least one of them was interested. The Spanish author of the letter requested a copy of The Trader's Guide and, to pay for postage, he included something that Ponzi had never seen before, an International Reply Coupon, or IRC. These were prepaid coupons that could be bought and exchanged for postage stamps in any country that was a member of the Universal Postal Union. They were commonly used by people who sent letters internationally to cover the costs of a return letter when they weren't expecting the other person to pay the postage. But for Ponzi, this simple coupon was a bolt of inspiration that was about to change his life forever. Years earlier, he'd learned about the concept of arbitrage, the strategy of buying and selling an asset in different markets to take advantage of price differences and make a profit. In the case of IRCS, They were always exchanged for the same postage value regardless of the country, but they were purchased at slightly different prices depending on fluctuations in the local currency. So in theory, Ponzi could buy an IRC in Italy, where the lira had taken a serious hit after the war, and then redeem it in the United States for American postage stamps, where the dollar value would be slightly higher. He would then sell those stamps and make a tiny profit. By scaling the operation to thousands, even millions of IRCs, he was looking at some serious money. This was Ponzi's new business plan, and on paper, it seemed not only like a good idea, but also perfectly legal. Arbitrage was a sound investment tactic that had been in use for centuries. So in January 1920, Ponzi started a new company called the Securities Exchange Company to handle what seemed to be his most promising business venture yet. Unfortunately for Ponzi, and eventually for thousands of innocent people, reality came crashing in to destroy his hopes and dreams once again. The truth was that the profits from arbitraging IRCs were so small that they would be completely wiped out by the costs of shipping the IRCs from one country to another. There literally weren't enough IRCs in the entire world to sustain the kind of operation that Ponzi was imagining. But here's where Charles Ponzi made the decision that would define his legacy forever. Rather than accepting this mathematical reality, he refused to let go of his idea. He was convinced that this was his golden goose, his one-way ticket to the life of wealth and luxury that he'd always felt he deserved. So when the legitimate business proved unsustainable, he turned his idea into the infamous scheme that would bear his name for all of history. After all, his plan to arbitrage IRCs sounded really good to people who didn't understand international finance, so even though it actually wasn't viable at all, maybe he could convince other people that it would work and take their money. Ponzi had reached the ultimate crossroads of his life. He could accept failure and find honest work, or he could become a criminal mastermind. He chose to turn his impossible dream into other people's nightmare. The Ponzi scheme at its core was similar to the classic fraud, robbing Peter to pay Paul, that Ponzi had witnessed firsthand back when he worked for Banco Zerosi. It involved getting people to invest in a business opportunity by promising them huge returns in a short amount of time with little to no risk. However, their money never actually got invested. Instead, the fraudster kept most of it for themselves while giving some of the supposed profits to earlier investors. When these early investors saw such large returns, most of them agreed to reinvest their profits back into the business to make even more money, thinking it was all working exactly as advertised. Many of them even told other people about the opportunity because they believed the earnings were perfectly legitimate. But in reality, all that was happening was that earlier investors were getting paid using money from new investors. It was a very simple but devastatingly effective system that preyed on people's greed and financial naivety, but it required a constant flow of new funds to keep the scam going. As soon as the fraudster couldn't find enough new investors to pay the returns to older investors, the con would inevitably collapse. Even though the scheme was named after Ponzi, he wasn't the first person to use this technique. A New York bookkeeper named William Miller had used the same method to con investors out of $1 million back in 1899, and a German actress named Adele Spitzeder may have operated the first known Ponzi scheme in history in the early 1870s. However, Charles Ponzi was about to take this old con to a level that no one had ever seen before. He was about to prove that the most dangerous lies are the ones that sound almost true. Chapter 5. The Rise and Fall of a Financial God. Using his system, Ponzi offered investors a staggering 50% return in 45 days, or a 100% return in 90 days. These weren't just good returns, they were mathematically impossible returns that should have sent up red flags for anyone with basic financial knowledge. But Ponzi had learned something crucial from his years of failure. He wasn't selling an investment opportunity, he was selling a dream. He claimed to have a vast network of agents all over the world who were buying IRCs in bulk and shipping them to America. If anyone pressed him for details about his operation, Ponzi would refuse to divulge any information, simply claiming that he couldn't share the specifics of how it worked because it might help his competition. This wasn't just clever deflection, it was psychological manipulation that made his investors feel like they were part of an exclusive insider opportunity. Most banks, established companies, and serious investors stayed far away from Ponzi. They knew when something was too good to be true, and anyone who understood finance could tell that it was impossible for Ponzi to deliver on his promises. But these weren't the people that Ponzi was targeting. He wanted people who used to be just like him, individuals with more dreams than common sense who were always looking for the best way to get rich quick. Ponzi understood that his true talent wasn't dealing with finances, it was dealing with people. He had an intuitive grasp of human psychology that he developed through years of charm, manipulation, and desperation. He knew how to sell his business without appearing too eager or aggressive, acting as if it made no difference to him whether potential investors gave him their money or not. This reverse psychology made people feel like they were missing out on something exclusive rather than being sold something worthless. Ponzi started with people in his own neighborhood and got 18 of them to invest in his first month. Once they were all paid their first round of profits exactly as promised, word started spreading like wildfire. Soon, thousands of people began crowding the streets outside Ponzi's office, desperate to invest their own money in this seemingly surefire opportunity. Month after month, Ponzi gained more and more clients, eventually raking in over $250,000 a day at the peak of his operation. To put this in perspective, that's equivalent to over $3 million per day in today's money. The Boston Post, the same newspaper that would eventually expose him, initially hailed him as a financial genius, which gave him even more perceived credibility and attracted even more investors. Soon, Ponzi was finally able to live the life that he had always dreamed of and felt he deserved. He moved into a giant mansion, bought expensive cars, dressed only in the finest clothes, wore gold watches and diamond pins, and went on lavish first-class trips around the world. It was everything he'd fantasized about during those nights sleeping in parks and working menial jobs. But there was a cruel irony in Ponzi's success. While he lived like a king, his investors were trusting him with money they couldn't afford to lose. But Ponzi didn't get to enjoy his stolen paradise for long. By the start of summer 1920, less than 6 months after he'd launched his venture, there were growing rumblings of doubt about his business. Initially, everyone was afraid to voice their suspicions because Ponzi had successfully sued a financial analyst for libel who'd accused him of fraud. After all, many early investors had been paid exactly as promised, which Ponzi claimed was proof that everything was legitimate. But then the Boston Post, the same newspaper that had once proclaimed Ponzi a genius, started to investigate his operation more closely. They brought in Clarence Barron, president of Dow Jones and manager of the Wall Street Journal, who immediately spotted the obvious mathematical impossibility of Ponzi's claims. By Barron's calculations, Ponzi would have needed to purchase 160 million IRCS to generate the returns he was promising, yet there were only 27,000 IRCS in circulation in the entire world. In July 1920, the Post presented Barron's devastating analysis on the front page of the newspaper, declaring Ponzi a fraud and prompting a government investigation into his company. But the wheels of justice moved slowly, and Ponzi was able to temporarily ease the concerns of government officials by cooperating fully and even agreeing to stop taking new investments while he was under scrutiny. However, Ponzi then made the mistake that would seal his fate. He hired William McMasters as his publicist, thinking that a professional could help manage the growing negative publicity. Unlike Ponzi, McMasters was an honest man who soon realized that his client was running a massive fraud. He later said, "Ponzi is a financial idiot. He can hardly even add. He sits with his feet on the desk, smoking expensive cigars in a diamond holder and talking complete gibberish about postal coupons." With access to Ponzi's financial records, McMasters collected all the evidence he needed and went directly to the Boston Post, where he wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning exposé detailing all of Ponzi's secrets. This time, the game was really over, and the house of cards came tumbling down. The Ponzi scheme collapsed overnight. Several banks had to declare bankruptcy. Tens of thousands of people lost their life savings, and Ponzi himself was indicted on 86 counts of mail fraud. However, even facing justice, the conman managed to strike a deal. He pleaded guilty to only a single charge of mail fraud and received just 5 years in federal prison. A relatively light sentence given the enormous amount of money he'd stolen and the vast number of lives he'd ruined. But this wouldn't be the end of Charles Ponzi's criminal career. Chapter 6. Never trust a reformed criminal. Ponzi was released after serving 3.5 years in prison, and if you think this experience finally taught him the error of his ways, you'd be completely wrong. Some people never learn, and Charles Ponzi proved that criminals don't change, they just change tactics. Literally, immediately after getting out of prison, he started planning his next scam. Ponzi knew that the government wanted to either deport him to Italy or imprison him again on additional larceny charges. So he fled to Florida, where he planned to essentially repeat the Ponzi scheme with a new twist. He started a company called the Charles Land Syndicate and sought investors to put money into property around Jacksonville. This time, he offered even higher gains than before, promising people a 200% return in just 60 days. The only problem was that the property he was selling was worthless swampland that would never be worth anything to anyone. But Ponzi had learned from his previous experience, and he thought he could use his reputation and charm to convince a new group of victims that he'd discovered another revolutionary investment opportunity. This time, however, there were no takers. People had learned about Ponzi schemes, and his name was already becoming synonymous with financial fraud. His new con was exposed almost immediately, and he faced being sent back to Massachusetts, where a lengthy prison sentence awaited him. Not wanting to go back to prison yet again, Ponzi changed his appearance and tried to travel to Italy as a sailor aboard a cargo ship. However, his luck had finally run out completely. He was recognized and arrested in New Orleans before he could escape the country. Ponzi was now a desperate man facing the consequences of a lifetime of lies and theft. He wrote to President Calvin Coolidge asking for mercy and even appealed to Mussolini to intervene on his behalf. But of course, nobody was willing to help a man who had become the face of financial fraud in America. This was truly the end of the line for Charles Ponzi. He was sentenced to serve another 7 years in prison, and the man who emerged was not the same charming, confident con artist who had once convinced thousands of people to trust him with their life savings. Ponzi was now a broken shell of his former self, having lost all the charm and confidence that had once made him so dangerously effective. As he faced deportation to Italy, his wife Rose chose to stay behind in America and divorced him, ending the last meaningful relationship in his life. The man who had claimed he was doing everything for love had ultimately lost the only person who had ever truly loved him. Ponzi spent his remaining years in poverty, with only memories to comfort him of the brief time when he'd had everything he thought he wanted. He ended up in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where he died in 1949 in a charity hospital and was buried in a pauper's grave. It was a fitting end to one of the most notorious rags to riches to rags stories in history. The man who had once stolen millions died without a penny to his name, forgotten and alone in a foreign country. But Charles Ponzi's legacy lived on in the worst possible way. His name became permanently attached to the type of financial fraud he'd perfected, and even today, over a century later, whenever someone uses new investor money to pay fake returns to earlier investors, we call it a Ponzi scheme. He'd achieved the immortality he'd always craved, but as a cautionary tale rather than a success story. The story of Charles Ponzi teaches us that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who break into your house. They're the ones you invite inside. They're the ones who understand that the greatest human weakness isn't greed. It's the desire to believe that we deserve more than what we have. Ponzi didn't just steal money, he stole hope, dreams, and trust, and he did it by selling people a lie that sounded exactly like what they wanted to hear. In terms of the actual amount of money Ponzi stole, he's not even close to being one of the biggest financial fraudsters in history. But his psychological techniques and his understanding of human nature created a template that's still being used by scammers today. Modern Ponzi schemes might use cryptocurrency, social media, or sophisticated marketing, but they all rely on the same basic principles that Charles Ponzi perfected over a century ago. The next time someone offers you returns that seem too good to be true, remember Charles Ponzi and the thousands of people who trusted him with everything they owned. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that there's always another Charles Ponzi out there waiting to turn your dreams into their fortune and your trust into your downfall. Charles Ponzi fooled an entire city with nothing but lies and charm. But he's nothing compared to what's coming next. A mastermind who stole billions and lived like a movie star while doing it. Smash that like and subscribe button if you want to see how the world's greatest financial criminals actually think, and drop a comment telling me which con artist should be next on our hit list.